We interrupt this program to bring you an important Wayfair message. Wayfair's got style tips for every home. This is Styles McKenzie helping you make those rooms sing. Today's style tip. When it comes to making a statement, treat bold patterns like neutrals. Go wild, like an untamed animal print area rug under a rustic farmhouse table from Wayfair.com. Arr, fierce. This has been your Wayfair style tip to keep those interiors superior.
Wayfair, every style, every home.
Hello listeners and welcome to Season 3 of the Cult Vault podcast. I'm your host Kacey and I wanted to update this introduction to offer a few additional trigger warnings about upcoming content. As you likely know, this is a podcast about cults, extremism, coercive control and abuses of all types. A platform for survivors and victims to share their experiences, change misconceptions and help advocate for and educate others. Given the recent election results in America and the nature of upcoming interview themes, I wanted to remind listeners that each episode comes with a content warning for themes of murder, abuse and harm, and abortion rights and restrictions. Please take care when listening to each installment. Self-care practices may include being outside for walks or gardening or leaning into friends and family and loved ones, or participating in an activity that brings you joy like a trip to the cinema, or exercise, or taking a nap. Whatever self-care looks like to you, be sure to practice these things when listening to this material and any other material like this. For early access to ad-free episodes, you can find me on patreon.com/thecultvault for as little as £1 a month. Thank you so much for my patrons for being such a beacon of support, and I look forward to our monthly video call catch-ups at the end of each month. Lastly, I'm so very excited for my favourite weekend of the year in June 2025, CrimeCon UK in London on the 7th and 8th of June. Partnered with True Crime, this is going to be the biggest and busiest and best CrimeCon UK to date, with expert speakers, survivors and advocates of justice taking to the stage to discuss their work in the field of true crime. It's the UK's biggest true crime event, and it's jam-packed with talks and events throughout the weekend, with the most flexible ticket options available, including day tickets, night tickets, weekend tickets, concessions, and different options for payment plans available now at crimecon.co.uk. I will be at the event. I'm so glad that I've been invited back again, and hopefully you will see me up on the big stage. And I look forward to seeing you all there. Head to crimecon.co.uk and use the code CULT, C-U-L-T, at the checkout for 10% off your tickets. And patrons, you can contact me for an additional reduction in ticket prices. Now, on to today's show. Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of the Cult Vault podcast. I'm your host, Kacey, and I'm really looking forward to introducing today's guest, who is a good friend of mine and long-time supporter of the podcast. Hello and welcome, John.
Hi, Kacey. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast to talk a bit about a group that I haven't covered on the show before. This is going to be an education for myself, and I imagine a lot of people are tuning in today. Should we start by asking you to introduce yourself to the listeners?
So my name's John. I'm in the UK. I have never been a member of a group such as this. In fact, I wasn't even invited. And I was just living an somewhat ordinary life until I discovered some things.
Leaving us with a cliffhanger there, leaving us wondering where things are going to go next. We are talking today about a group called Educo. Now, sometimes I say Educo, but I do believe that it is Educo. Would you say that's correct?
I would have gone the other way, but you're right. There are different pronunciations, so who knows? I think, in fact, I don't even recall the leader saying the word. It's always been someone else. So who knows? Could be something else.
Either or. Educo, that's the group that we're going to be talking about today. But as I said, I haven't covered this group before. So how would you give a summary of Educo in terms of where it came from, who started it, what its main mission statements are, and how it's changed over time?
So, yeah, it seems to have been it almost followed all different types of templates for these types of groups. So what I know is it started in the late 60s in Dublin as a yoga group. The leader, Tony Quinn, or Dr. Tony Quinn, as I'd like to call him, he grew up in a suburb of Dublin and had a belief that he was speaking to God, and God had given him a form of yoga. What's been reported is he wasn't very successful at school, and so started off being a bouncer, but then moved on to running yoga kind of classes in Dublin. And by 1974, there were yoga classes in Belfast, so it crossed over into Northern Ireland and all over Ireland. And he's credited for introducing yoga into Ireland. So that's where it started. And there were communes. He was running communes. So people would join these yoga classes, and some of those people would end up joining the communes. And I think that's how it kind of operated until the mid-80s. And then it started to pivot, maybe between the mid-80s to mid-90s, pivoted to personal development seminars and that type of group. But it was, and what I've heard is that the people in the communes were turfed out, and some of those people didn't take it so well. It wasn't done by Quinn. I'm told he was on an airplane to the States. So he was jetting around in the 70s and 80s to the States and in the UK, and his new business manager turfed him out. So it originated as yoga classes with communes, and then moved into personal development, and that's where it's kind of, that's the template it follows now.
This Tony Quinn figure, did he accumulate enough money through these yoga classes and communes to be able to jet set around the world, or was there something else involved that allowed him to kind of have that financial freedom? So
this group and Tony Quinn were first reported on in the Irish press in 1974. And one of the early articles does talk about his money and the things that his followers had bought him, and the fact that he was, although I think in the early 70s when they talk about jetting around, it was more to the UK. But yes, so he was being given cars. There's talk of people being on little or no money, working for him. So yes, there's always been an aspect of his followers enriching him.
I think it's really interesting that yoga, which I think is, and somebody correct me if this is wrong, yoga, which is a term that was translated from Sanskrit originally and came from India like some 5,000 years ago, and is quite separate from Christianity, is being co-opted by a man in Dublin who thinks that God is giving him a form of yoga. That's kind of like a blend of several different things in one thing.
In fact, in 1974, there was an article by a lady called June Levine. She was a prominent figure in the Irish women's movement, quite a well-known lady and journalist and writer in Ireland. She interviewed Quinn in 1974, and he was he made the distinction between his form of yoga and the yoga that originated in India. He had his own form of yoga that was bestowed upon him by a god that speaks to him in his head.
Why would it be called yoga then? That makes no sense. Like maybe I'm just reading too much into it.
Well, I imagine it's useful for bait and switch. It's useful for that.
Yeah, certainly. It does seem that way, but maybe I'm just being cynical. I know that Educo has branched out over time into more areas of personal development, wellness, and fitness. Can you talk us through a bit more about how this kind of Irish empire has grown nationally and almost internationally?
So, there are many branches to Quinn's kind of business ventures, although they're more like franchises, although some of the details of these franchise models are unsustainable and have proved to be unsustainable, although a number of these branches are still operating. So there are two kind of well-known businesses that have come from this group, and they're still operating today. The first one is Educo Health, which is a food supplement business. Quinn has always had a fascination with nutrition, shall we say, or lack of it, possibly. I was referring to a 1974 article that also reported about 40-day water fasts. So there's always been a fascination with what I might call diet control, and that has a synergy, one might say, with a food supplement business. And that food supplement business or previous incarnations of it have faced scrutiny in Ireland from the authorities. And another branch, and probably the most, although both these are well known to anyone who walks a high street in Ireland, I'm told. Another branch is Educo Gym, which features a machine that was invented or created by Tony Quinn called the Time Machine. And it's basically a single unit that has all of the different kind of gym workstations around it. And watching videos of people using this machine is quite amusing because they're all around this column doing their kind of stuff. It's just amusing. So that's still operating to this day. And that business has kind of shrunk. It's now only exists within Ireland and one outpost or two outposts in Belize, of all places. But it was in the UK. It was in the city of London. I would have walked past it in around 2018. I would have walked past it in the city of London, not knowing anything about it. So
I've seen videos of Quinn working with people, I believe, in a hypnotism capacity. I don't know if he calls himself a hypnotist.
Oh yes, yes. He that was in fact that's his main qualification, which is again challenged. But yes, him being a hypnotist, and one is when he first moved into Educo, when he pivoted from that yoga kind of group, was the focus was on hypnotism and him being the practitioner of that.
Right. So he starts off as sort of like a successful businessman, bringing in this new flavor of yoga and wellness. And then, on the surface, that sounds kind of like, something that a lot of successful business people have managed to do with their own brand and flavor of something that already exists 100 times over. Think about all the fast food chains and how Burger King just does something slightly different to McDonald's, and McDonald's does something different to KFC, and et cetera, et cetera. Then we get into this stuff with these videos of him healing people and performing miracles and hypnotizing people. And that's where it starts to change into what I would say is dodgy territory. So you've mentioned Belize, and that's a really random place to have, a few of your gyms set up when most of your business is conducted in Ireland. So how does that happen?
So yeah, this was an oddity, but it is important to the story of this group. And I've got to be honest, when I first was reading about this group and I came across this detail, I did kind of mentally throw up my hands and just say I'm done, because this just seemed to be a kind of divine blessing, or for want of a better expression, of this group. But it is actually important, and underneath the covers of this, there's a lot of really kind of nasty things that were going on, and it really does show you the extent of the kind of hidden personality of Tony Quinn underneath this, because this did bring about kind of scrutiny from the press and the TV and within a legal context. So he was laid bare at the end of all of this. So with telling the story of how he ended up in Belize. So what I know is in the early 2000s, this Tony Quinn was running quite successful seminars, and they were happening all over the world. They were happening in America, Spain, North Africa, I'm told Southeast Asia, but mainly Bahamas and LA and Monte Carlo as well. And people were going there, and it was word of mouth. Some of these, many of these seminars at that time were very expensive. We're talking about 20,000 euros for the starter, and I think going up to about 60,000 euros for the advanced one. And you could pay 100,000 euros for a week with him. People were doing that. So what I'm told is that people were going to these and they were participating in this seminar. It's worth noting that there are leaked recordings on what was going on in these seminars, and people have described what's been happening in these seminars. And I would describe it as 12 long days of hypnosis and hypnotherapy from Tony Quinn, people practicing hypnotherapy on each other. And people have talked about this and having that recorded. So they were divulging their innermost secrets. There were press reports of people talking about people revealing their sexual assaults and crimes that they've committed, and if they were sexually abused as children, and that was recorded on video. And obviously there's an elation that's maybe associated with kind of revealing that kind of detail for the first time. So, but there are other recordings of people flailing around on the floor and screaming, and what I might call group psychosis, or there's a psychiatric term, I forget, but it's related to folie à deux, but it's folie à for multiple people. So people were going on these seminars and experiencing, spiritual highs, presumably interpreting that as being something good. Now, and this did appeal to people who were entrepreneurial, or certainly that was how it was sold. Maybe appeal isn't the right word, because this is a group that's using questionable practices. And one might say they were being targeted. They were targeting entrepreneurial people. Two of those, well, in fact, there was more than two. I think originally there were two. Two of these entrepreneurial people were a lady called Susan Morris and Sheila McCaffrey, and they had met each other it's reported on the lawn of the White House under Clinton's administration. So this was before the Good Friday Agreement, and at the time, I think there were events held by the White House or on their grounds at least, and kind of sponsoring business ventures. And one of those business ventures was the idea of an oil company. Susan Morris was a geologist from Ireland, from Dublin. From Belfast. Sorry, she was from Belfast. And Sheila McCaffrey was a lady from Ireland. And they met at one of these gatherings. And it's been reported that McCaffrey recommended to Susan Morris the seminar, which she went on, I think, 2002. And then from there came an oil company. And they had permission to... So Susan Morris had a vision of oil being in Belize. She was an accomplished geologist, and she did to drill in Belize. She knew there was oil there. It wasn't, I'm told, viable for the bigger companies. Whilst they did drill there, it just wasn't a priority. So she saw an opportunity. They raised funds through the Educo seminar. So I think it's something like 300 attendees of the seminar were propositioned to invest in this venture. I'm told this was happening at the seminars and at the meetings that were happening in Dublin. And it's said that Quinn, at the time, so we're talking about early 2000s, between 2002 and 2006-ish, Quinn was dissuading people from investing in this venture. It was not something he was blessing. And it turns out, I think I might have the years wrong, but around 2006, they did strike oil in Belize. They drilled a second hole. Although, I'm told that the area was well surveyed. So it was just a case of, it wasn't the bigger companies just didn't see longevity in that source. So on the second drilling, they did strike oil in Belize.
So how does Quinn go from dissuading people to invest in this oil venture to becoming like a core member of this oil company in Belize?
So Quinn didn't invest. He was given. He was made a Class B or Class A shareholder. So I think he was given. I might be wrong. There's differentiation between Class A and Class B. I think he was given Class A. So he was made at the same level as a founder. And there were five founders, and he was appointed to the board and given an allocation of shares that were of higher quality than the Class B shareholders, the people who invested the 300. So our Irish investors, and so obviously with it striking oil, he kind of did a vault face and said, no, I made this happen, or certainly that's what was said by others who were involved, other founders. They said he made this happen, and he was appointed to the board. And obviously this was a great big thing and a big feather in the Educo's kind of wherever you put feathers. And so he's appointed to the board, but then things start to go wrong. So Quinn failed at his secondary education. People who've met him have remarked on his, he's not really the person he portrays himself to be. So one might imagine him, in fact, this was stated later, one might imagine him not to be the greatest businessman ever. So what can be said is that after he was appointed to the board and he was made a director, that a number of the founders then wanted to extract themselves from that board and to extract what they'd invested. So one of the gentlemen did die before they struck oil. So there was 3 other founders who, Sheila McCaffrey amongst one of them, who then wanted to remove themselves from this with Tony Quinn on the board. And they were describing the fact that it wasn't being run above board. So the first one to remove themselves was an English gentleman by the name of Paul Marriott, and he's quite well known in the industry, and he extracted himself from this in I think the Supreme Court of the Eastern Caribbean, and what's nice about this gentleman is that he's in the oil business, but when he extracted himself and did it through the courts, he did what he could to encourage people to stand up, and there were other investors who had seen their allotment diluted, and this other person appointed as director, and this gentleman Paul Marriott removed himself, but he did talk about how he hoped people would stand up and for their rights and deal with that, and good on him. But that seemed to trigger a sequence of events where the other 2 remaining founders then started legal action. I should interject here that I talked earlier about this company, Belize Natural Energy, being founded by 2 people, Susan Morris and Sheila McCaffrey. Now, Susan Morris is someone who has been and was at that time very loyal to Tony Quinn, but Sheila McCaffrey wasn't. She was one of the people who took legal action to remove herself. But before that legal action happened, and she was the chairwoman of this business, and in fact she's feted by many of the investors, and some of them are on record as saying that's why they invested in the business in the first place. Right. It's because of her. So at the time when she was trying to extract herself, there was she experienced a lot of what we might label as fair game. So she has talked about her being isolated from this business, and she was the chairwoman. of this business. She was isolated, but obviously on being isolated, other things were happening as well. So she talks about, and this was reported in the press, there were false police reports made about her. And it's been alluded to who made that, but it originated from the business, from Belize Natural Energy, and an arrest warrant was made for her. And this is in Belize. Belize is one of those countries where you will see on those Channel 5 documentaries worst prisons in the world. And there are cases, there are cases of people who've faced pretty bad conditions in prisons in Belize. And I'm told she was arrested. She hasn't really spoken much about her time. She's alluded to it, and when she talks about it in a BBC documentary from 2012, and it's really heartbreaking seeing her talk about that. She's stiff upper lip lady. She went to Belize and she started an oil business, an oil company. So she's hard as nails, I would say, but it's heartbreaking seeing her talk about that. And you can read, I read between the lines how difficult that was. So she went through the ringer with this group. This group really went out, and that was just because she protested or had views on the fact that someone who was telling people not to invest in her business then was given a number of shares and appointed to the board.
Really? Quinn just gets to carry on riding on this roller coaster while everyone else is trying to get off. And to this day, it still stands with him and Susan Morris kind of together at the tippy top of this kind of pyramid.
No, so I needed a break from the story because it's such a crazy story. What's remarkable is that, so I think this was kind of happening from about 2006 to 2012. I'm compressing a big story, and I might have some of the dates wrong, but what can be said is that no, Quinn did not get his way. I mean, I suppose when it comes to money, and we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, although some people make it an order of magnitude more than that. When it comes to that kind of volume of money, there are other parties that kind of get interested, and there are other checks and balances. I talked before about Sheila McCaffrey and other founders taking legal action. Mm-hmm. So there was legal action. In 2012, there were a number of court cases against this business and Susan Morris and Tony Quinn. And there were court hearings in a number of places around the world. So Sheila McCaffrey took a case in the Eastern Caribbean Supreme Court in 2012. And it turned out there that it was, I think she was looking to, I don't know what it was. I think she was looking to have the business wound down. She had been kicked off the board. She was no longer chairman. She'd been isolated, and she was looking to have the business wound down, I think. Now, the Eastern Caribbean Supreme Court didn't wind the business down, but they did state that she had been invalidly removed from the board, thus vindicating her. And, that's why I used the phrase false police reports earlier on, because she, they were claiming she stole property from the business. And if the Supreme Court decides that you were invalidly kicked off the board, I think that kind of suggests that it was a false police report. Another detail that kind of came out there's a number of details that came out, but I think the most significant one is that the one prop that was used to justify Tony Quinn's placement on the board was a document, the operating agreement for the business from, I think, 2006. And a document was presented to the court that seemed to support the assertion that Quinn was right to be on the board. But it turned out it was a forgery, and the judge said so. It was just, it was a forgery, and that forgery was concocted by a barrister who was a follower of Tony Quinn since the 1970s.
Oh my,
and
that is wild.
Yeah. So the judge stated that Quinn was invalidly appointed to the board, amongst other details that came out of that case.
What happens after that? You said that Susan Morris was and is a faithful supporter of Tony Quinn. So I'm guessing that they didn't fall out from this fallout of the oil company.
No, so with Sheila McCaffrey being found invalidly removed from the board, I think she was offered her position back, and I think she was there temporarily, but then she left, and who can blame her? So Belize Natural Energy saw many of its, all of its founders either die or sought legal action to remove themselves, apart from Susan Morris. There was another case as well. So we talked about 2 legal actions. There was another legal action, and this happened in 2 courts. It happened in Colorado and the Irish High Court. So it was the same legal action, but I think one was a counter-sue action. So this also happened in 2012. There was another founder for Belize Natural Energy, a gentleman called Jean Cornac, and I'm trying to think if he's. I think he might be from Belize. I might be wrong, but he also sought to remove himself. He was. There was an agreement that his shares would be bought off him, so he would silently walk away from this business. But that agreement apparently wasn't followed through, so he was suing for payment of his shares.
Yeah.
But what happened there was, I think there was a counter-sue action that by Susan Morris against Jean Cornac. So in 2012, there were this group were finding almost weekly news reports about it in the press. Sunday World were almost every week running stories about this, often double page with photographs. And there's a group in a kind of charitable trust in Ireland called Dialogue Ireland, and they were really at the forefront of reporting on this group, as they've done with other kind of groups.
Right. So when you say that this story was being featured in the Sunday World newspaper almost weekly, what capacity were the stories? Was it kind of like interest in this oil company that's imploding, or was it explicitly like Tony Quinn is a cult leader?
So it started off with he's a cult leader. And in fact, the Sunday World first used the word cult in regard to Tony Quinn in 1974. From the get-go, the word cult was used by the Sunday World. But it started off with look at these mad seminars, and as the story progressed, it moved on to the oil.
Right.
I mean, the way I see it is this group pivoted, or the leader pivoted to remove himself from scrutiny, and he pivoted onto the oil business. An opportunity presented itself to him, and he took it. And he probably would have left the self-development kind of world and moved into the oil business if he'd been permitted to. So the story just followed that kind of lineage.
Right. Okay. So it's a wild story, and it has so many different elements and layers and different parts of the world that play significant parts in the story overall. I know that there's some interesting things around where Susan Morris lives over in America when she's not in Belize, and, just different things that all kind of thread together. And we just don't have the time to go through all of it today. But there are several websites and resources that people can access where they can look at the entire timeline of this whole group, which includes a bit more information about Dr. Tony Quinn before he invented Irish flavor of yoga. Is that right?
Yes, you're right. This story it's like a fractal. You can go off into every direction and continue forever. But I think it just highlights the fact that if you get involved in this group and you find success, that success is going to be short-lived for many people. And I think one other detail is I know we kind of tailed off at the end there on the third court case, but I think it's important. One of the details of that court case was that this group were looking to have a journalist and a cult expert appear in depositions in Colorado to reveal their sources. And the Irish High Court stepped in and said no. So
wow.
There was an entitlement felt by the people involved in this business that a journalist and a cult expert who was helping survivors should reveal their sources so that this business would know who they were and would deal with them as they were dealing with other people involved who had spoken out about this group.
Well, I guess that leads us directly into talking about your personal involvement with Educo, because you said you've never been part of a cult or a high control group, but you're almost like, at this point, a historian on Educo as a group. And I know it's not out of interest for Tony Quinn, just like, wow, he's an interesting guy. I'm going to learn absolutely everything about him and his enterprise, just for kicks, just for giggles. So I don't know how difficult some of this stuff will be for you to talk about, but I know that a lot of it is heavy, and I know that it's been a very, very difficult few years, to say it lightly. How did you become aware of Educo, and how has this group impacted your life?
So how did I? Yes, it's an interesting question, because I could start in one of two places. I could start in the late 90s, early 2000s, although I didn't know about Educo, or we could start about when I actually found out about Educo as a thing in November 2020. And there were certain parts of the story I'm not going to touch on for legal reasons at this point in time. That might change in the future. But what I can say is that November 2020, we were, I think, in lockdown, maybe second lockdown, but we were in lockdown. And I was doing what many people were doing at that time, which was watching Dr. Ramani on YouTube. I had no interest in the subject matter she was talking about previously, but for some reason during lockdown, I did. And Dr. Ramani is a respected professor, I think, in the States, who talks on the subject of narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder. And I just found the subject during lockdown of interest at that point in time. I think we were all watching different subjects on YouTube and learning about them. And so I was watching these videos, and I was, grappling with the subject, because there are splits within it. There are, there's different types of narcissists, and obviously I hadn't really considered this. So I was watching these videos, and I could kind of grasp and understand the overt narcissist type, although there's probably a better description of that. But I was really struggling with the covert narcissist at the time. I just didn't get it. So I was just watching these videos and hoping that it would seep in. And just around that time, watching these videos, I was obviously connecting memories of people I knew and trying to fit them into these templates that I was figuring out. And one person fitted this template of the overt narcissist. And I was like, oh yeah, well, yeah, maybe they are. And I just thought nothing of it. But then as I started to understand the covert narcissist, the vulnerable narcissist, someone else that I knew fitted that template as well. And these two people are actually connected, and I knew 25 years ago. And at that point, although other things were going on, I had an epiphany, and I was able to say, wow, those two people fit those templates. So I still haven't explained how I know about Educo. So 4 days after having this revelation of these personality types of these people I knew who were connected, I Googled one of them, and up came a webpage about a cult. And that was quite interesting. It was surprising. But then doing further Googling, I found out that the covert narcissist I knew, well, I'm going to call covert narcissist, was also in this Educo that other people were calling a cult, and I call a cult. But then, so I was trying to absorb information about this group. It was scattered in a number of places. There were newspaper articles. There was a Dialogue Ireland website, which is which is the resource on the internet about this group. But as I was Googling about it and just trying to learn stuff, because we were in lockdown, another name came up in these searches that I recognized. And I checked this name with people from the era when this name figured in my life. And people confirmed, this was someone you worked with back in the early 2000s, late 1990s. So I was in a position where I knew 3 people who were in Educo, and there was a document online that talks about them rising to the top of this group around 2008, 2009. And it was just a shock, really, because it's not the shock necessarily that they're in a hole, but that they're associated with practices that I find abhorrent. So I very early identified the human trafficking practices. I spent a number of years working in an industry where there's mandatory, biannual mandatory training in identifying human trafficking practices, and reading a number of these newspaper articles and ex-member testimonies. It was obvious to me that there were human trafficking practices that went all the way back to 1970s. Whether people like it or not, I know some people are uncomfortable with that word, but I would welcome him to go and partake in some of this training, and then we'll talk about it. So I know some people object to it, and that's okay. But I think there needs to be an understanding of what human trafficking is before dismissing it.
You are in lockdown, you're watching Dr. Ramani's videos. She's such a legend as well. Just a massive shout out to Dr. Ramani. We were all doing different things during lockdown. I think that's definitely true for many of us that are listening. We can think back to that time and be like, what was I doing during that time? I started a podcast. But you're watching Dr. Ramani videos and you're realizing that some of the different types of narcissism she's describing you are familiar with in people from your past life that all now happen to be involved in some capacity with Educo. And did you know the name Educo from when you knew these people 25 years before?
No, it does. No, so I don't. It doesn't ring any bells. It was interesting on finding out this stuff. A number of memories did resurface. But the memory, there was no recollection of Educo as a thing. But I do have memories that are more significant now about events around that time. So and in asking people about that era, that ex-colleagues that I compared notes with when finding this stuff out, there was one colleague who confirmed to me that there were attempts to recruit him into something that involved seminars and a hard sell. And I was present at a dinner where the subject matter was on self-development. And although I didn't realize it was that significant.
Then, right. So if the fork in the road would have gone a different way, there's a chance that you could have ended up recruited into this group at some point.
No. So I would never, I would never have been recruited into this group. So I can explain why my sensibilities and my values are not aligned to this group, and were known to not be aligned at that time by these people. So, for example, I had strong views even at that time of a bit of awareness of totalism, although I didn't know it was totalism at that time. It was something of importance to me. I was 26 at this time, and an idealist and young, and that was where I had pitched my kind of whatever you pitch, tent. So that's where I was. So I would never have been recruited into this, and so it was never even put to me. And in fact, one might say that given I knew 3 of these people at that time, and they've all risen to the top, and in fact I kind of brought these 3 people together, one might say it was actually concealed from me. And that's what I believe. So I don't believe I would ever have been recruited in.
Right.
And in fact, they were recruiting my work colleagues. They were being approached, but I wasn't.
So you connect all of these dots decades later, and what do you do with that information?
Yeah. So, what do I do? It's information. So I try to integrate it into my thinking, and I ask myself, what do I do about this? And the conclusion I come to is I need to do something about this, because they are still operating in the UK, in Ireland, and the fact is I was able to link these people together, and there's no public record of them being together, and it turns out that was an important decision, because it's been kind of confirmed to me that these people are still, although some are persona non grata, but they're still significant figures in the UK arm of this group. So I decided that whilst I'm not against their beliefs, they can believe that this guy speaks to God. They can believe that, and he's able to put them into a state that you and I can't get into. They're more
that
elevated.
He can cure cancer. That's one of them, isn't it?
Yes, he can cure cancer. That's been reported since 1978, and continues throughout the years. It's a totem that they stick to. So the decision was to try and interrupt the recruitment, and to get, or rather to give people who are being recruited a fighting chance. That was the objective. So I kind of immersed myself in trying to understand cults, and one of the, and your podcast being one of those important kind of outlets to learn. And one of the important lessons is, you can't, once someone's in the group, there's not much you can do. I mean, there are things you can do, but I think the real, where the energy should be focused is on prevention. So in fact, there was a video by Dr. Alexandra Stein where she's giving a talk where Stephen Hassan is there, and she talks about prevention being important, and in fact she, in her soft way, so way I might say it might come across wrong, but she kind of says we need to do something about the recruiters. And so that was something I absorbed and I took on board.
I don't know how much of this you can speak about currently, but it was not too long after November 2020, I started to get messages from you telling me that you've just been released from jail. These wild messages to get randomly, it sounded like somebody was making things up, messaging me and saying, hey, I've just had this wild experience where these things have just happened. But of course, you were not making up any of these things.
Yeah, so that was the first time that I had a surprise holiday in June 2021. So not 6 months after finding this stuff out. So I think that was on the 28th of June 2021, which coincidentally or not was a week after someone in America published an article comparing Tony Quinn with Keith and Nexium. And this is someone Frank Palotto, who runs the Frank Report, and anyone who has followed the Nexium story knows that Frank Palotto and the Frank Report are involved in a number of significant events and exposing that story. And Frank Palotto had written his own article about Tony Quinn. I didn't know about this, and this was published on the 21st of June 2021. And then a week later, 6 days later, 5 days later, the 3 police turn up to take me away.
This is because you are actively connecting dots on the internet about Educo at this point, and putting information out into the world, and just trying to kind of, I don't know, let the world know about some of the things that you're finding on the internet. I'm just wanting kind of to understand randomly why 3 police officers would show up on your doorstep.
So we talked earlier on about, the court cases around the oil company. Some of that was, there was fair gaming against anyone who spoke out about this group in negatively. I mean, from their perspective. So I'm told. I've been told by an insider that it was ordered by Up High for another member to deal with me because of that article. So that article was seen as a threat to, an existential threat to Educo and Quinn, especially if you consider, how it was Frank Parlato, who is named in the 2017 New York Times article that brought Nexium onto the world stage. So it was, presumably, that was seen as something that could not be permitted. We've got to remember this is a man who believes he speaks to God. So anyone, you can't be doing that. You can't be publishing. I don't know what he's thinking to publish that.
So you're making noise online, maybe like making your own assertions on how you think that there could be similarities between Tony Quinn and Keith Raniere. And then by chance there is an article that's released that says that explicitly, and then you're the one that gets knocked on.
I think I was making comments on the message board. So on finding out about Educo, I was learning about cults, and the Frank Report message board was one helpful place. So the message board had brought together a number of themes: cults, narcissism, and hypnotism, and NLP. So it was a useful place for me to to try to get some understanding of what Educo was and what I was learning about. So I can't remember what I was trying to...
No, I'm just trying to... It's so complicated that I'm just trying to lay out the kind of foundation of this experience kind of step by step. So this article goes out, you're being blamed or seen as at least partly responsible due to your noise making online and the conversations that you're having with other activists in the space. These 3 police officers knock on your door. And what do they tell you? They're like, what do they charge you with something, or do they just whisk you off?
No, I'm not charged. It's I'm not going to go into details because it's entangled with something else that it wouldn't be right to talk about at this point in time. But I was essentially whisked off to somewhere, and I was held for 24 hours, and I was, after 24 hours, there was some other events that happened, but I was basically told to go away, go home. But I didn't know I was going to go home. But I was kind of told that someone connected to this group had made a complaint about me that wasn't true, and there was no evidence for, but it was acted on. But when it came to actually justifying my detention, there was no evidence.
Really terrifying. That's so terrifying that at some point in the day or the night or the middle of the night, police officers could knock on your door and whisk you away without any evidence.
That's just the first time.
But this is the thing, right? So then you get home and you're like, that was wild and scary, and I hope it doesn't happen again. But lo and behold, it just continues.
Yeah, that happened a number of times in 2021 from the same person. Again, this person, I'm told, was instructed to have me dealt with, and they tried this a number of times, and a number of times it led to me being taken. But ultimately, each time, I was told to go away. And different people were telling me to go away. So they were trying different things, but none of it stuck. And it ended up at a point where this did continue. Although, so the last time that I was taken away was in 2021, but in 2022, these complaints there was another group making simultaneous complaints about the same complaints. So in May 2022, or was it March 2022, I started So because of these raids by the police, I started trauma therapy on the NHS. So that was in my local health authority. I was fast tracked to do. I'm not going to go into the modality, but trauma therapy with a doctor, and it's something like 22 weeks in total, 6 weeks educational program, and then the remainder with a doctor on a weekly basis. And I tweeted that I was going through trauma therapy. And then shortly after that, a hate website appeared about me. And it talked about, me being raided by police. It had other details that only the police would know, or the person who made the complaint. And it talked about the fact that I was undergoing trauma therapy, that I was unhinged. I had serious problems, and it talked about me complaining about a group that runs seminars. So to me, it's quite clear who authored that article, and also just the facts that are laid out in it. I'm pretty sure we sourced those details, but that was published in May, and it was being posted on Twitter and Reddit a lot. And at that time, I was helping, amongst many other people, I was helping people who were doing activism and ex-members of Lighthouse International, or a very British cult that the BBC made a documentary and podcast about. So I was helping people on this group, and all I was doing was applying what I'd seen had worked for Educo, because I learned about Educo in 2020, but there's a good 15 years of activism that's documented on the Dialogue Ireland website, and so I've seen a history of successful activism against Educo, and what works and what doesn't. And one of the things that Dialogue Ireland does and has done very well is a moderated discussion forum. So things are tempered. People are allowed to say what they want to say, but defamatory remarks are moderated out. And so I had connected with some of these relatives of Lighthouse International. And in fact, I'd approached Dialogue Ireland, and I said, look, can they use your website to talk about their experience? And Dialogue Ireland were helpful, but they couldn't do that because they're a charity in Ireland, so they can't be devoting time to a UK group. So Lighthouse, and so the ex-members ended up using Reddit, which they used really successfully, so they did it themselves. And I was just helping out, moderating on that. It wasn't doing much. There was peaks and troughs, so there were some nights I was very busy on it, but most of the time I wasn't doing anything at all. But I was encouraging them to speak and to talk, but within limits. And so I had a hit website that was clearly published by members of Educo in May 2022. And within a week, that was being shared with Lighthouse, and there were Lighthouse-connected accounts trying to post that hate website on Reddit that I was a moderator for. So within a week, that webpage being published by Educo, it was in the hands of Lighthouse International, who were also using it to try and have me dealt with.
Yeah.
And between May and July of 2022, there was a new campaign of filing false police reports about me, but these were coming from Educo members and Lighthouse International group members. But there were some days I was getting calls from more than one police station in the country, and one of those calls would be a complaint by an Educo member. The second call would be about Lighthouse. So there was, I would say, there was a coordinated and simultaneous campaign. But what's important to note is in July, that kind of came to a head, and I was being called in for interviews, but then it stopped, and I never did attend an interview to talk about any of these complaints. But I was requested to attend an interview with the police to talk about what Educo was. So I reading between the lines, because obviously you're not privy to what the police do internally, but reading between the lines, I suspect that someone in the police went, what's going on here?
Yeah.
This is odd. And also at the same time, the Lighthouse International were under Home Office investigation and insolvency service at the behest of the business secretary. So I suspect that someone in the police went, this doesn't add up.
Yeah.
And that's where it ended.
And you've continued to make noise about this group on the internet and in other spaces ever since, despite all of these fair gaming and like gang stalking efforts from both.
Well, I mean, so most of the stuff I might put online is actually stuff that is just historical record or things that they've said. But yes, I do. I just try to turn the soil and just keep things fresh. So, there are details about Educo that are just astounding, and I think they're worth talking about, even if it's just me.
At the end of all of it, you lost a number of close work friends to a group that you didn't realize was at least accused of being abusive and exploitative. So, I mean, it's kind of like trying to do civil duty, I suppose. You have this information and you're just trying to make other people aware of it. Especially because there are still very active recruitment tactics happening. You said earlier that the company, the organization, the enterprise, that it's still active, but the recruitment elements of it are still active as well. So if we can make people aware of that, then I mean, I don't know if I can say that I would. I don't know if I'd be able to continue in the way that you've continued if I had the pressure of, or the worry of having the police knock on my door randomly. There's a chance that could happen anytime with the work that I do here. But that's why those tactics are used, right? To scare you into stopping, to create that element of fear, to make you realize that they have more power and authority and more influence in other areas like the police department and other parts of the private and the public sector, at least here in the UK and in Ireland when it comes to Educo, that it makes you think, who am I? But of course, now we've seen what's happened with Lighthouse International, not just the fallout from being in court and being told to wind the company down, but also the expose that took place in the BBC documentary and podcast series. The continued fallout happens when you follow Lighthouse International online and just see their efforts to paint Catherine Nye, the creator and host of the documentary, as some kind of like evil villain in the Lighthouse story. The person that she's a liar and she's working for the corrupt BBC and all of these different things. So it does work. We've seen that it works, but it is so scary. And I can't begin to imagine all of the things that you've been through and the level of courage that it takes to carry on doing what you're doing, because it's not just the noise making about Educo. You network people together. You connect people together. I speak to so many people who say, oh, we have a mutual friend, and it's always you. You work behind the scenes. You don't want any recognition. You don't want anybody to give you any praise, even though that's what I want to do right now because it's never happened and it should happen. You do so much incredible work. There's a website that you've created called cultpodcasts.com that you've just done as like another, favor to society that just catalogs every single cult podcast episode that's ever been released by any content creator ever. It's such an incredible resource. You have the Twitter bots and the Reddit bots that you've created that curate all of these playlists and episodes together. And you just do it because you're concerned for the safety of people that are being pulled into and harmed by these types of destructive groups. I think it's absolutely incredible what you're able to do just in the background on your own, despite everything that's happened to you and everything that both of these groups have put you through.
Yeah, it's so. Thank you. I mean, I think it's the Cult Podcast website. What's important about that is the content. So that's podcast episodes. That's the work that you're doing, that your colleagues are doing, and that's giving voices to survivors to tell their story. Because I think that's where the real power in doing something about these groups lies, is in having survivors talk. So we talked about how Educo and Lighthouse kind of have worked in parallel to try to silence me, and they haven't succeeded at all. In fact, I would go as far as saying that well, let's put it this way: every time Lighthouse turn up somewhere, the police are not far away. And I can also say that Educo's attempts to talk themselves as being police friendly, even going as far as claiming they have ex-police officers as members, I suspect that not many police would entertain that idea at all anymore now. So these attempts to intimidate people have failed. They were never going to succeed. They worked in the short term, but I think at least with the police in the UK, any complaint made by either of these groups is going to be scrutinised and dismissed, whereas originally they might have been considered valid, but none of them have held water. So it's important, I think, to the stories of survivors to be heard, and that's where, if we're going to do anything about these groups, that's where it's going to start. It's going to start with listening and appreciating and valuing the stories of survivors. That's where it's at. And we're finding at least 20 to 30 podcast episodes a day on this subject. Most of them are survivor stories. So, it is happening. People are talking, and the stories are worth listening to.
I just think it's incredible what you've been able to do. And I know that we've really only scratched the surface, like the tippy top of the iceberg when it comes to Educo. You've got a website that you've put together, that I think is still active, and it has every resource, newspaper article, every archived website mention, anything online or in papers that's been released that mentions Tony Quinn or Educo, it's all on this website that you've made.
Yeah, I've got to give credit to Dialogue Ireland. They're the ones who had this information, but their job is not to document Educo, it's to help survivors. And so I've kind of just use that information to present it in a different way. So if you were interested in the history of Educo, you could get it in one place, but it often links back to Dialogue Ireland, where the source material is.
Yeah, because you don't ever give yourself credit for the work that you do, and it's such good work.
It's worth saying that those websites have actually been vetted by the Metropolitan Police as well, who say that they're just doing what they do, which is talk about whole. So,
I've been saying for years.
Yeah, there was an attempt to have them taken off the internet. There's, but and using the police to do that, but it didn't work.
Well, I've been saying for years, please let me talk to you about your experiences. Please let me talk to you about Educo. I just want to have this conversation. And you've said, I can't, and now you can, and now we have. And there's just so much that has happened since we first started talking. And there's so much that I think will happen in the future in terms of exposing this particular group and lots of the more kind of scandalous criminal activity that we can't talk about or that we don't have time to talk about that is linked to Quinn's past life before all of this stuff and also his life during all of this.
There's lots of skeletons in the closet. There's lots of stuff that has been covered up. And we know this, and you're right. With every group, and this is why I'm hopeful. And this is something I learned very early on. With every group, they always meet the same eventualities, always. And whether or not the leader is still with us or not, it all comes out, and it is going to come out with Educo, and I think it's going to shock a lot of people how far its tentacles have reached. I would like that eventuality to happen with Quinn still with us. That's what I prefer.
Yeah, but he's getting on a bit now.
He's 78. So whatever happens, it's going to happen, and we're not going to have to wait too much longer.
Yeah, yeah. And you were saying that you've never been part of a cult, but I do think that you are a cult survivor after everything that you've experienced, and that you've been able to access trauma therapy. Well, the fact that you had to access trauma therapy and you've been through those things and you're still learning and you're still on your recovery journey because of the way that the cult has impacted you personally.
That's a really important point, I think, is what you've just said, because that's something I struggled with, was where do I fit? And I have had cult survivors tell me, no, you're one of us. And that is really helpful because until I kind of accepted that, I didn't know where I sat. And I can sit alongside a cult survivor. Our experiences are different, and not every cult survivor will say that that's the case with me, but that's where I feel I am.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same controlling tactics that are used against you, but just different reasons.
Yeah.
Just not to keep you in, not to keep you under the thumb, but rather to keep you quiet and to keep you scared.
Yeah. And if I had memories and recollections of being in a group, those tactics, I'm certain, would have worked, because I would have fallen back onto those attachments with those people. But I don't have those attachments. So whilst their behaviors are the same to try and intimidate me, there's a second part to the puzzle that just isn't there to reinforce that. So I've faced the bullying, so I can appreciate how those behaviors could affect someone who has had attachments to people in these groups, and how it would make them revert to considering this group to be important. Whereas I lack that.
Well, I feel like we are kind of kindred spirits in this space in some ways, because we both kind of started our own self-education journeys around the same time into this particular subject. And we've almost been kind of doing our journeys alongside one another since you first reached out to me. And I just know that there is such a wealth of knowledge that you've gathered, and you have a very compassionate and supportive approach to the work that you do and the way that you speak with people. And you always have cult survivors' wellness and what is best for them at the forefront of the work that you do, even if you do find yourself in heated debates and discussions on online spaces, because I know you do get yourself into some hot water sometimes.
True. But yeah, you're right. Dealing with these groups, because they are a blot on society, they do so much harm, so there does need to be some more action against them. It is going to come from survivors, and survivors of these groups have been manipulated, and parts of their lives have been stolen from them, and so they are entitled to make mistakes, and they're entitled to find their way, and that includes those who speak out and those, the majority who don't speak out. So they are they are the most important people in this entire effort.
Yeah. See, I've really enjoyed sitting down and having this conversation. I'm so appreciative to you, John. And thank you for allowing me to pick your brain about all of these things that I've wanted to kind of get down in audio format for such a long time. Is there anything that you would like to say to anybody listening who may be a part of Educo? Because I'm sure they're going to pick this episode up, and I'm sure they're going to listen to it and see if there's anything that they can use in the episode that can be used to get police officers to knock on your door or my door or whatever it is that they decide to do. Anybody that's in Educo that might be listening, anybody that's left Educo that might be listening, and just cult survivors as a population of people overall. Is there anything you'd like to say before we sign off today?
Yeah, there's a couple of people I'd like to address. So the people who are feeling unable to come forward, that is to be respected. There are people they can connect to, not just me, but there are other interesting parties that would like to hear from people, and they will find them online if they go looking for it. There's one of the reasons I did this today was because I wanted for there to be an Educo episode on Cult Vault, but no one would do it. So I'm here doing it, and thank you, Kacey, for allowing me to do this. But there are a number of people who stood up against this group, who and have faced horrendous kind of abuse and infringements on their liberty. And the only reason I'm able to have the knowledge about this group is because of the fight that they fought and the crap that they went through. So there's many people, and some of these people I've never spoken to. Some people I have spoken to and I have corresponded with. And they will, if I've ever shown you any appreciation in those communications, then I'm talking about you. And then I suppose the other thing is to say when it comes to intimidation and tactics by this group, I think that at least in the UK, and I suspect in Ireland as well, that those efforts are ineffective at this point in time. I think that it's been a tactic that they've tried to use, but it just doesn't fly anymore. And so if there was a desire or a fear that people are going to come after you, I think if there's strength in numbers, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
And there's one other person to thank as well. And that's your wonderful editor who sits through all of these episodes and has accumulated a knowledge that is on a par with yours, I suspect.
Oh,
and
yeah.
They are wonderful.
I think that they should award him an honorary MSc from the University of Salford, because he certainly does know exactly what I know at this point. And that just means he can't get out of conversations about cults with me and coercive control. He can't use the excuse of being dumb in the subject. So that's my partner, and he's absolutely wonderful. And I know that he'll appreciate you saying those things.
And it's him who inspired the Cult Podcast website. It's him who actually inspired that. So credit needs to go to him for putting that thought into my head that rattled around and made me go, God, that would be very straightforward to do. So credit is for him.
When he's coded, he's like, oh, do you know who would know about this? John. And then he's like, I need to message him. So I know he'll be glad to hear about that, and he'll appreciate that. And we appreciate you and the work that you do. And I'm so sorry for everything that you've experienced, but I'm glad that you're on the other end of it now, speaking out about your experiences in the same way that you've said the most important people are the ones telling their stories.
Yeah.
So I'm going to throw you in that category now, and hopefully you'll let yourself be celebrated a little bit, because I know you're like a little silent warrior. And I'm always like, I've got a friend, but he works, kind of behind the scenes, and he'd be able to put you in touch with somebody that knows about this or this or this or this. So I will put the links in the episode description to some of the websites that you've put together. Also, I do mention this a lot, but cultpodcast.com, I'll put a link to that website, and also the Cult Podcast subreddit that we co-moderate, but that I would say you moderate more, because I don't go on Reddit very often. And thank you so much, John, for your time today. I was so glad that we finally got to do this.
Thank you, Kacey. It's been great, and it does remind me that this group, its story needs to be told. It's meandering, mad story. The entertainment value, and we know.
I know
for the funny bits.
I know. I mean, I just can't wait for the documentary. There's going to be one day. It's inevitable.
It's there.
It's inevitable. Yep. Cult podcasts and cult documentaries are the flavor of the month right now. And if there's any producer that's looking for a story, they have one with this group.
I'm not saying a word.
I'll leave it there. Take care, John, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye.
Thanks, Kacey. Bye.